The air in the top-floor boardroom of Apex Vanguard had the density of a black hole. It sucked the confidence out of every single person seated at the $10,000 mahogany table. 7 candidates sat in a perfect row of corporate purgatory, their tailored suits suddenly feeling like cheap burlap under the weight of a single, penetrating gaze. Kael Sterling did not blink. He stood at the head of the table, a monument of bespoke wool and calculated menace. At 25, he was the youngest CEO to ever command the Sterling City skyline, and he looked at the 7 terrified faces before him with the detached interest of a hawk surveying a field of wounded mice. His chief of staff, a jittery man named Harrison, dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. "Mr. Sterling, as you know, the data leak at Zenith Enterprises has sent shockwaves through the sector. We need a crisis manager who can not only anticipate threats, but neutralize them before they escalate." Kael's gaze swept across the line. Candidate 1, a man with a sweaty upper lip who looked ready to cry. Candidate 2, a woman whose hands trembled so violently her portfolio shook. Candidate 3, a man who had the audacity to smile. Kael filed his name away for immediate termination from the potential hire list. Smiling was a sign of weakness. "Escalate," Kael repeated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to make the floor-to-ceiling windows vibrate. "My definition of escalation is the point where I have to read about a problem in the Sterling City Journal. So far, each of you has failed the first test by merely existing in my presence." A pin could have dropped, and it would have sounded like a gong. Harrison's handkerchief was now soaked through. Candidate 1 looked like he was calculating the quickest route to the fire exit. And then, the heavy glass doors to the boardroom groaned. They didn't slide open with the smooth, hydraulic hiss they were designed for. They were pushed. Hard. A loud, grating shriek of rubber on marble sliced through the oppressive quiet. Elara burst through, a whirlwind of pink and determined energy, carrying a canvas bag the size of a small suitcase. Her vibrant chestnut hair was pulled into a messy but somehow elegant knot, and a pair of blue light glasses were perched on her nose, slightly askew. She was a splash of watercolor in a room painted in shades of obsidian and steel. She surveyed the room, her stunning green eyes scanning the long table, the terrified candidates, and the imposing giant of a man at the end. She saw the tension. She felt the hostility. She completely, utterly misinterpreted it. "Wow," she said, her voice bright and clear, cutting through the fear like a bell. "I knew the Sterling City Knitters Collective had a big turnout, but this is a whole other level." She gestured vaguely at the candidates. "You guys look intense. Did someone drop a stitch?" Kael's head pivoted slowly toward the intruder. The air in the room, already thin, seemed to evaporate entirely. Harrison made a strangled, choking sound, but Kael raised a single, imperious finger to silence him. He didn't recognize her. He didn't recognize her bag, or her cheerful demeanor, or her complete and utter disregard for the sanctity of his boardroom. Elara, oblivious to the apocalypse she had just waltzed into, plopped herself onto a low, white leather sofa near the floor-to-ceiling windows. She didn't look at the terrified candidates or the enraged CEO. She only had eyes for her bag. With practiced efficiency, she unzipped it and began to unload her arsenal. First, a heavy ball of bubblegum pink cashmere yarn. Then, her prized possessions. A pair of long, gleaming titanium knitting needles, almost 12 inches in length, with sharp surgical points. "The traffic was a nightmare," she announced to no one in particular. "I missed the last 20 minutes of my podcast. I need to get to 142 stitches before the end of the first row, or I'll lose my place in the pattern. It's a new double knit technique. Very unforgiving." Candidate 3, the smiler, now looked utterly perplexed. Candidate 2 had stopped trembling and was just staring, her mouth slightly ajar. Kael, however, was watching her with an intensity that could melt steel. He saw a woman, breathtakingly beautiful and unconcerned, entering a war zone with a smile. He saw her pull out metallic, lethal-looking instruments. He heard her speak of a pattern, a first row, and a technique. It was a code. It had to be. A sophisticated, layered, almost hypnotic code designed to sow confusion and misdirection. He leaned forward, his palms flat on the polished wood. His knuckles were white. "Harrison," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Who is that?" I have no idea, sir," Harrison stammered. "Security is on its way." "Cancel them," Kael ordered, his eyes fixed on the young woman who was now meticulously counting on her fingers. "This is the most interesting thing that has happened in this building in 3 years." Elara, still unaware of the silent chaos she was creating, began to work. She cast on her first stitches with a series of sharp, decisive clicks. Clack, clack, clack. The sound was a rhythmic, aggressive counterpoint to the strained silence of the boardroom. Across the table, Candidate 1, his name was Bernard, and he was a corporate spy for Zenith Enterprises, felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. In his suit pocket, nestled between his heart and a nervous twitch, was a small USB drive containing Apex Vanguard's upcoming acquisition strategy. It was the classified USB drive Harrison had discreetly mentioned. Bernard had to get it out. He just needed a distraction. The insane knitting woman in the corner was a gift from the heavens. As Kael began to circle the table, his footsteps a slow, deliberate click of Italian leather on marble, Bernard made his move. He saw his window. With a sudden, explosive lunge, he shot out of his chair, his hand diving across the polished table toward a leather portfolio that lay near the edge. The portfolio contained the decoy documents. The real USB was concealed in the portfolio's spine. The leather slid under his desperate, grasping hand. It skittered across the surface, a blur of brown and silver, before flying off the edge and sliding across the gleaming marble floor. It came to a dead stop at the toe of Elara's pink suede ballet flats. The entire room froze. Bernard was halfway across the table, his expensive Italian loafers scrambling for purchase on the polished wood. His face was a mask of panicked triumph. His fingers were inches from the portfolio. Elara, who had just reached her 142nd stitch, was in the zone. The yarn was flowing. The pattern was clear. She was a woman at peace with the universe. Then, the catastrophe happened. A grunting, sweating mass of a man appeared in her peripheral vision. His flailing hand smacked the side of her canvas bag. The bag tottered. A skein of precious imported cashmere, the exact shade of a flamingo, rolled out and bounced across the floor. It was a direct hit. Her sanctuary had been desecrated. Ugh! Elara's voice, previously a chirp, became a guttural growl of pure frustration. "Are you kidding me? I am on the 142nd stitch of a 7-row repeat. A repeat! You have just totally thrown off my count. Do you have any idea how long it takes to cast on 142 stitches?" She didn't even look up. She didn't see Bernard's panicked face or the CEO's intense, unblinking stare. All she saw was the interloper's hand reaching for her precious, now dirty ball of yarn. Without a moment's hesitation, she brought her hand down. Slam! The titanium knitting needle, a 12-inch spike of silver, drove straight through the luxurious wool of Bernard's jacket sleeve and embedded itself into the solid oak table. The force of the strike sent a shudder through the heavy piece of furniture. The thwack was a sharp, percussive crack that echoed off the glass walls. Bernard howled. He was pinned. His arm was trapped flat against the table, the needle having pierced his sleeve and the wood beneath with the surgical precision of a master archer. He tugged, but the needle was held fast. He was completely immobilized. The tension in the room, which had been at a 9, instantly shot to an 11. Candidate 2 let out a sharp, terrified gasp. Candidate 1 fainted, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. But the silence that followed was the loudest sound of all. Kael's breath hitched. It was a microscopic, almost imperceptible hitch. But Harrison, standing nearby, saw it. Kael's pupils dilated. They flared wide, swallowing the icy blue of his irises. He had just witnessed something he didn't think was possible. The woman had not blinked. She had not flinched. She had not even looked up. In one fluid, elegant, and devastating motion, she had neutralized a security threat, embedded a weapon into his boardroom table, and was now completely ignoring the screaming spy she had just impaled. She was a ghost in the machine, a predator of the highest order. Elara let out a long, agonized sigh. "Great," she muttered. "Just great." She yanked the needle free from the table with a sharp scrape. Bernard yelped again, clutching his tattered sleeve and scuttling backward, his espionage mission utterly, catastrophically forgotten. Elara pointed the needle, its tip now slightly marred with wood splinters, directly at the cowering corporate spy. "Look at this," she snarled, her tone icy. Her tone icy and scolding. "You have made me drop a stitch." Kael was mesmerized. He saw her point the needle at the downed spy, her expression one of cold irritation. He heard her accuse the man of dropping a stitch. It was a euphemism. It had to be. Dropping a stitch meant making a mistake. It meant failing the mission. It meant being eliminated from the game. She was not just neutralizing the threat. She was delivering a psychological deconstruction of the man's incompetence right there on the floor. "You," Kael's voice boomed across the room, echoing with a new, almost reverent energy. He pointed a long, steady finger at Elara. "You're hired." Elara, who had finally managed to pry her flamingo pink yarn off the floor and was now frantically trying to recall her place in the pattern, looked up. Her beautiful face was a mask of pure annoyance. She blinked, processing the words. She looked at the terrifyingly handsome man pointing at her, his custom suit flawless, his expression intense. She then looked at the knitting needle in her hand, the spy clutching his arm, and the deafening silence that now surrounded them. She let out another, more dramatic, groan. "Ugh, fine. I know I'm late." She assumed he was the head of the knitting convention. "I just need to get my stitches back on track. Do you have a spare row counter? My app is frozen." Kael nodded, a slow, decisive dip of his chin. He was utterly captivated. She was playing hard to get. She was demanding a tool to further her process which had just involved a near-fatal assault. His mind was a hurricane of corporate-inspired awe. This was not just a crisis manager. This was a master strategist. She operated on a level so far above his other candidates it wasn't even a competition. They were playing checkers. She was playing a 6-dimensional chess match while knitting a scarf. "Harrison," Kael ordered, his voice sharp but unable to mask the faint tremor of excitement. "Get her anything she asks for. A row counter. A new app. Evict this man." He gestured with a flick of his wrist toward the still whimpering Bernard. "Send his bill for the destroyed sleeve to his employer at Zenith." A subtle, nasty smile touched his lips. "Add a $10,000 crisis management consultation fee for our new head of the department. It's the least they can do." Bernard was physically dragged from the room by 2 security guards who had finally arrived, looking utterly lost. Elara barely noticed. She had found a small, empty conference table in the corner and was laying out her tools. She was muttering to herself, recounting her stitches. The CEO of Apex Vanguard, the most feared man in Sterling City, was standing 10 feet away, watching her rearrange balls of pink yarn with the same intensity he would watch a hostile takeover. He watched as she picked up the needle she had used to impale the spy. She frowned at it, then rubbed the tip on a small piece of sandpaper she had pulled from the bottom of her bag. "Perfect," she murmured, holding the needle up to the light. Kael's heart thudded. She was inspecting her weapon. She was field stripping and refining her tool right in front of him. She wasn't just skilled. She was a perfectionist. She was a lethal, brilliant, and utterly captivating perfectionist who spoke in a code he was only just beginning to decipher. A code of stitches and yarn and ruthless efficiency. He had been searching for a weapon to decimate his enemies. He had been looking for a shield to protect his empire. He had found a girl with a giant bag of yarn and a titanium needle. He was sure of it. He had found his secret weapon. The heavy boardroom doors groaned shut behind the retreating back of Bernard the spy, the sound a dull final thud that sealed the corporate tomb. Harrison, still dabbing at his forehead, had to physically prop up Candidate 2, who was now weeping silently into her hands. The other candidates were a tableau of frozen terror, their carefully rehearsed answers vaporized by the sheer insanity of the last 90 seconds. Kael did not acknowledge any of them. His gaze was a laser, fixed on the pink-clad whirlwind, who was now meticulously smoothing a ball of yarn that had been defiled by its brief encounter with the floor. She was muttering under her breath, a stream of incomprehensible jargon about increases and decreases, and something called yarn dominance. "Bring her to my office," Kael ordered Harrison, his voice low and urgent. The voice of a man who had just found the winning lottery ticket and needed to get it into a vault. "Now, clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Cancel the rest of these interviews." He turned on his heel and strode toward the private corridor that led to his inner sanctum, his footsteps echoing with renewed purpose. The air in the boardroom seemed to rush in behind him, the vacuum left by his presence instantly filled by the panicked whispers of the candidates. Harrison scurried over to Elara, who was now holding her knitting needle up to the light again, inspecting its pristine, deadly point. "Miss?" Harrison squeaked. "The CEO would like to see you in his private office. Immediately." Elara looked up, her green eyes wide and uncomprehending. "What? Why?" "I haven't even gotten the room set up yet. I need a flat surface, preferably one that's not covered in the sweat of that weird man who just got dragged out." She gestured with her needle toward the empty spot where Bernard had been pinned. "He was really sweaty. It was gross." Harrison made a sound that was half choke, half whimper. He wants to discuss your employment." "Oh," Elara's face brightened. "Right. The grant. I suppose I should talk to the man with the checkbook." She shoved her needles and yarn back into her giant canvas bag with practiced efficiency, the titanium shafts clinking against the metal frame. "Lead the way." Harrison practically jogged through the corridor, his short legs struggling to keep pace with Elara's longer, more carefree stride. They passed a series of glass-walled offices, each one filled with employees who had apparently frozen mid-task, their eyes tracking the strange woman with the giant bag as if she were a ghost. Kael's office was a monument to corporate power. The walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Sterling City's glittering skyline. The furniture was all sharp angles and dark wood, like a boardroom designed by a medieval architect. A massive desk sat in the center, its surface as bare and forbidding as a glacial shelf. Kael stood behind it, arms crossed, his towering silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun. Elara walked in and stopped. She looked around, then let out a low, impressed whistle. "Wow," she said. "This is a lot. Do you have a lot of meetings here? It feels very meeting-y." Kael gestured to the chair opposite his desk, a low leather number that was likely worth more than the average small car. "Sit." Elara dropped her bag on the floor with a heavy thump and slumped into the chair. She kicked off her ballet flats, a casual act of rebellion in this temple of formality, and tucked her feet up under her. She looked like a child about to be scolded for drawing on the walls. "Okay," she said, pulling a single needle and a new ball of bright, electric orange yarn from her bag. "I'll listen to your pitch. But I want you to know, my time is valuable. I've got a pattern to finish." Kael sat down on the edge of his desk, directly in front of her. He was close now, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, to smell the faint scent of lavender and wool that clung to her. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "I'll cut to the chase," he began. "I need you to tell me how you handle malicious entanglements." Elara's hands, which were busily casting on a new row of bright orange, paused. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Malicious entanglements?" He nodded. "When forces you didn't anticipate try to weave themselves into your operations, to strangle your progress, to knot up your supply lines." He was using her language. He had learned her code. It was brilliant. He was showing her he could play her game. Elara considered this. She looked down at her yarn, then back up at him. "You mean like a tangle?" she asked, her voice genuinely puzzled. "Precisely," Kael said, his eyes gleaming. "A tangle, a web of deceit, a hostile takeover by an outside entity." Elara snorted. "Oh, those are the worst. Look, if it's a simple knot, you can usually pick it out with a needle. Gentle pressure, a little patience." She demonstrated by teasing a small loop of yarn with her needle tip. "But if someone's actually trying to ruin your work, if they're twisting things up on purpose?" Her expression hardened. A flash of genuine irritation crossed her beautiful features. "You don't mess around. You cut it," Kael's breath caught. "Cut it?" "At the source," Elara confirmed, her voice brisk and clinical. "You find the core knot, the one everything else is radiating from. Then you take your snips." She mimed a sharp, decisive snipping motion with her fingers. "You cut it clean. Then you burn the ends." A hot flush crept up the back of Kael's neck. He had never, in his entire life, felt such a visceral, instantaneous reaction to a business strategy. She was recommending a scorched earth policy. She was talking about surgical, preemptive decapitation strikes. She was a terrorist in the boardroom, and he wanted to make her his queen. "Burn them," he repeated, his voice a little hoarse. "To prevent reknotting." "Exactly. That's the thing. You can't just leave a frayed edge. It'll unravel the whole piece." She held up the orange yarn, showing him a clean, neat, perfectly snipped end. "You have to make it clean. If you leave an opening, they'll just try to worm their way back in. It ruins the texture. It ruins the whole project. Better to end it decisively." Kael was leaning so far forward he was practically in her lap. His knuckles were white against the edge of his desk. She was talking about texture. It was code for corporate culture. She was talking about a project. It was code for his entire empire. She was brilliant. She was utterly, terrifyingly brilliant. He pushed himself off the desk and began to pace. The energy in the room crackled. He was a man possessed. "What about escape routes?" he asked, whirling on her. "Do you ever leave your opponent a way out? A bind-off? Or do you just eradicate?" Elara looked confused again. "Bind-off? That's just how you finish a piece. It's permanent. You can't just bind off and then undo it later. That's the point." She shrugged. "If you're in a project, you're in it until the end. If you want to get out, you don't ask for a bind-off. You just don't start the project." She looked at him like he was a particularly slow student. "The only way out is through the end." Kael stopped pacing. His mind was a whirlwind, a permanent bind-off, no escape routes, total commitment to the project. That was the most ruthless, most focused philosophy he had ever encountered. This woman was a singular force of nature, and he had to have her on his side, not just in his company, in his life. He marched back to his desk, sat down, and pulled out a checkbook from a locked drawer. He scribbled a number. It was a number that would make most people faint. Then he tore the check from the book and slid it across the polished surface toward her. $1 million, he stated. It wasn't a question. Elara's hand froze mid-stitch. She looked down at the check. The zeros swam before her eyes. She blinked. She looked up at him, her mouth slightly open. For what? Chief Special Assistant. To me. Starting immediately. Kael's voice was a command, etched in titanium. You report directly to me. You handle my entanglements. You manage my projections. You protect my assets. He paused, his gaze intense. You are my new secret weapon. Elara stared at the check. $1 million. She thought of her rent. She thought of the 6 skeins of cashmere she had been eyeing at the boutique yarn store downtown, the ones she couldn't afford. She thought of the impossibly complicated pattern she'd been trying to master for months. This wasn't a grant. This was a commission. This was an arts and crafts grant on an industrial scale. This man was clearly some kind of eccentric billionaire art patron, and he wanted her to be his resident artisan, chief special assistant. It probably meant he wanted a giant custom blanket for his boardroom or something. She did not connect the dots to the corporate espionage, the pinned spy, or the dead-eyed candidates. She lived in a world of knit and purl. His world was just a strange, scary place where people used weird words for things. The money is acceptable, she said, trying to sound professional and failing miserably. But I need to know the scope of the project. What am I making? Kael leaned back in his chair, a smug, predatory smile playing on his lips. He saw her question about the project as a question about his business strategy. He needed to feed her the information she needed to dismantle his rivals. I need you to focus on the Great Sterling Textile Merger, he said, using a fictional name that sounded both corporate and, to his ears, perfectly aligned with her yarn obsession. It's a hostile entanglement that I've been trying to pick apart for 6 months. They are the knot in my side. I want you to cut the source, and I want you to burn the ends. Elara's eyes widened. A textile merger? Are you buying another yarn company? Is this about the cashmere distribution monopoly? I knew it! I knew the supply chain was being manipulated. She was incensed on behalf of knitters everywhere. The audacity of these corporate fat cats messing with her precious fibers. Kael's smile deepened. Yes, he purred. Cashmere distribution. Precisely. They're trying to corner the market on the softest asset, the most delicate component of our portfolio. I need you to neutralize them. Elara nodded vigorously. Say no more. I'm in. Manipulating cashmere supplies is a crime against humanity. Where do I start? Kael rose from his chair and walked around the desk. He stood over her, his tall frame casting a shadow across her small, orange-knitted creation. He was looking at her with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. Start here, he said, his voice low. In my office. I have files. I have data. I have a list of targets. You will tell me which ones to snip. He emphasized the last word, his gaze intense. Elara looked at the barren surface of his desk. Where are the files? She asked, looking around. Kael's face flickered with confusion. The files are in my head. I'll dictate them to you. You'll analyze them with your tools. Elara stared at the man, baffled. He was a strange, strange individual. But he paid well, and he seemed to have the right enemies. The kind of enemies who manipulated cashmere. Fine, she sighed. But I need a proper workspace. This chair is horrible for my posture. And I need more light, natural light, and a really good coffee machine. Kael's eyes lit up. She was taking charge. She was making demands. She was asserting her dominance over the territory. He loved it. He loved every single insane second of it. Harrison, he bellowed toward the intercom on his desk. Get a knitting lamp, a comfortable chair, and the best espresso machine money can buy. Immediately. He turned back to Elara, who was now frowning at a knot in her orange yarn. She pulled out her titanium needle and, with a swift, precise motion, sliced through the offending loop. She held up the 2 severed ends and then, to Kael's absolute quivering delight, she held a lighter up to the frayed edge and singed it shut. The acrid smell of burnt wool filled the air. See? She said, holding up the clean, sealed end. Permanent. Clean. No escape route. Kael felt a tremor run down his spine. He had found his weapon. He had found his partner in corporate crime. And she was terrifying. He extended his hand. "Welcome to Apex Vanguard, Miss?" Elara took his hand. Her grip was firm, surprisingly strong for a knitter. "Elara! Just Elara!" Kael smiled. It was a sharp, predatory smile that promised chaos. "Welcome, Just Elara. You start today. We have a textile monopoly to dismantle." The sharp clatter of Elara's canvas bag hitting the sleek mahogany desk sent a ripple of alarm through the executive floor. Harrison, who had been tasked with settling her in, flinched as if a grenade had been dropped. The desk was a masterpiece of minimalist design, positioned directly outside Kael's imposing office doors. It was meant for a personal assistant, a gatekeeper, a corporate sentinel. Elara looked at it, then at the chair, then at the stack of unopened files Harrison had placed in the center. She pushed the files aside with a dismissive sweep of her arm. They slid off the desk and landed on the floor with a dull thump. Harrison made a strangled sound. "Oh, sorry," Elara said, not sounding sorry at all. "I need the surface space. Can you get me a trash can? A big one." "I'll need it for the scraps." Harrison nodded frantically and scurried away, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to process the scene. He had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder at Apex Vanguard. He had seen hostile takeovers, boardroom coups, and at least 3 separate instances of international espionage. He had never seen a woman unpack 4 giant skeins of teal cashmere yarn onto her desk like she was preparing for a siege. Elara hummed softly as she worked. She laid out her tools with the precision of a surgeon, her titanium needles, a row counter, a small pair of snips, and a tape measure. The teal yarn was a deep, oceanic color, rich and impossibly soft. It was the kind of yarn that cost more per ounce than gold. She had been saving it for a special project. A wrap, maybe a shawl, something dramatic. She looked at the massive skein. It was a beautiful, twisted hank of fiber, but it was useless in its current state. It needed to be wound into a ball. It needed tension. It needed her. Across the desk, the heavy oak doors to Kael's office were closed. Through the glass, she could see him pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing emphatically. He was talking to someone. He was talking to a lot of someones. The conference call had been going on for 45 minutes. Elara didn't care about the conference call. She cared about the skein of teal yarn, which was now mockingly tangled around its own core. She tried to wind it on her own, holding it between her knees, but it was too big, too unwieldy. She needed a second set of hands. She needed a yarn winder. She didn't have a yarn winder, but she had a CEO. Without a moment's hesitation, Elara marched toward the glass doors. She pushed them open with enough force to make the hinges groan. The sound of Kael's voice, deep and commanding, filled the space. "And I want the quarterly projections revised to reflect the new acquisition strategy. If Zenith thinks they can undercut us on the East Coast, they are sorely mistaken. We will." Elara walked directly into his line of sight. She planted her hands on her hips and stared at him. "I need you." Kael's voice died in his throat. His eyes, which had been blazing with corporate fury, suddenly softened. He held up a single finger to the phone. "Hold, gentlemen." He muted the call and lowered the device. "What is it?" Elara pointed at the skein of teal yarn, which she had brought with her. It was draped over her arm like a limp, expensive snake. "This is a hank. It needs to be wound into a ball. I can't do it myself. The tension is all wrong." Kael blinked. He looked at the yarn. He looked at her. Then, in his mind, the translation software kicked into overdrive. Tension. Wrong. She needed him to assist in a delicate operation. She needed his hands. She needed his physical presence to calibrate the pressure on a volatile asset. This was an exercise in trust, in synchronization. "Of course," he said smoothly. He unmuted the call. "Gentlemen, I have a critical operational matter to attend to. We'll reconvene tomorrow." He ended the call before anyone could respond. Elara's eyes widened. You just hung up on them? They can wait, Kael said, rising from his chair. He walked around his desk, his movements fluid and purposeful. What do you need me to do? Elara gestured to the empty space in front of her. Hold out your hands. Like this. She demonstrated, holding her arms out in front of her, palms up, elbows slightly bent. You're going to be the winder. Kael mirrored her position. His arms, broad and powerfully built, stretched out before him. The sleeves of his charcoal suit strained slightly against his biceps. He looked like a man preparing to catch a falling anvil. Elara stepped closer. She was close enough now that he could count the individual lashes framing her vibrant green eyes. He could see the faint, almost imperceptible sheen of gloss on her lips. She smelled like lavender and something else. Something sweet. Something that made his pulse quicken. Okay, she said, her voice dropping into a focused, businesslike tone. You're going to hold the hank like this. She draped the teal yarn over his outstretched arms. The skein formed a loose loop, the center of it resting in the crooks of his elbows. Keep your arms slightly apart, not too wide. You don't want to stretch it out of shape. The gauge is everything. Gauge. She was talking about the gauge. Kael's heart hammered against his ribs. Gauge was a corporate metric. It meant the precise measurement of risk versus reward. She was calibrating the tension on the asset. She was preparing to wind it up, to contain it, to make it manageable. He held his arms steady. He was a rock. He was a pillar of corporate stability. Elara stepped even closer. She was now inches from him. Her head tilted down as she inspected the loop of yarn. She reached out and adjusted the skein, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his suit sleeve. The contact was electric. A jolt of warmth shot up Kael's arm. Too loose, she murmured. Bring your arms in a little. I need the tension tighter. Kael obeyed. He pulled his arms closer together, his hands now almost touching. The loop of yarn tightened around his forearms. Elara nodded approvingly. There. That's better. Now hold still. She reached into her bag and pulled out the end of the yarn. With practiced dexterity, she began to wind it around her fingers, forming a small, tight center. Then she started to wrap, slowly and rhythmically, building a ball around that initial core. Wrap. 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 The motion was hypnotic. Kael stood frozen, his arms held out like a crucifix as Elara worked. She was completely absorbed in her task, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her fingers moved with a delicate, almost musical precision. The soft, silky sound of the yarn sliding against her skin was the only noise in the room. Kael watched her. He watched the way her lips pursed slightly as she focused. He watched the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. He watched the way her hair, a few strands of it, had fallen loose from her messy bun, and now framed her face like a golden halo. She was so close. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body. He could see the faint, almost translucent skin on her neck, the delicate curve of her collarbone. She was a vision. She was a goddess. And she was winding yarn around his arms. You're holding it too tense, Elara said, not looking up. Relax your shoulders. You're going to throw off the gauge. Kael forced his shoulders to drop. He hadn't even realized they were raised. He took a slow, steadying breath. His corporate mind, the part of him that was always calculating, always strategizing, was utterly offline. He was a man holding yarn. He was a man being bossed around by a beautiful woman with a knitting needle. And he loved every second of it. This is a psychological focus exercise, isn't it? He asked, his voice a low murmur. Elara glanced up at him, her green eyes momentarily meeting his intense blue gaze. What? No, it's winding. It's just winding. You're thinking too much. Just keep your arms steady. Kael nodded. Of course. She was testing his ability to obey, to follow her lead, to commit to the operation without questioning the methodology. It was a classic psychological tactic used by elite operatives. He had read about it in a book on military strategy. She was conditioning him. She was forging an unbreakable bond of trust and obedience. He would be the best yarn winder she had ever seen. Elara continued her work. The ball was growing now, a neat, compact sphere of teal. She wrapped and wrapped, her movements becoming more confident, more fluid. She hummed softly to herself, a tuneless little melody that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "You've got a snag here," she said abruptly, stopping her winding. She reached out and touched the yarn near his left elbow. Her fingers brushed against the inside of his arm, just above the cuff of his sleeve. Kael's breath hitched. She began to tease the snag, her fingers working the knot with a gentle, patient pressure. "See, this is what happens when you don't maintain the tension. You get little knots. They ruin the flow." She tugged gently. "There. Got it." Kael watched her fingers, those delicate, nimble fingers that had just impaled a spy. Those fingers that were now soothing a knot in a piece of yarn like they were comforting a child. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. It was intoxicating. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, his voice rough. Elara shrugged, still focused on her work. "Since I was 10. My grandmother taught me. I was always a fidgety kid. Knitting helped. It calms my brain, focuses my energy. It's like meditation, but you get a sweater at the end." Meditation. Yes. That made sense. The repetitive motion, the controlled breathing, the intense focus on a single task. It was a form of tactical meditation designed to sharpen her mind and hone her instincts. She was a warrior monk, a fiber-based assassin. He would have to learn to knit. He would have to learn her language, her rituals, her sacred techniques. He would have to become worthy of her trust. Elara wound the last of the yarn onto the ball. She pulled the end free and tucked it neatly under a strand, securing it in place. She held up the finished product, a perfect sphere of teal, and examined it critically. "There," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Perfect tension. No snags. A clean ball." She looked at him, her eyes finally meeting his. "You can put your arms down now." Kael slowly lowered his arms. The absence of the yarn around them felt strange. Hollow. He flexed his fingers, trying to restore the circulation. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little too formal. "That was instructive." Elara grinned. "You're a natural. You have good shoulders for winding. Nice and wide. Good base." Kael felt a flush of pride. He had good shoulders for winding. He was a natural yarn winder. It was the most absurd compliment he had ever received, and he would treasure it forever. "I'm going to need you to do that again," Elara said, walking back toward the door. She was already pulling another skein from her bag, this one a deep forest green. "I have like 8 more hanks to wind. This one's a cashmere blend. It's even more delicate. You'll need to be careful." Kael straightened his tie. "I am always careful." Elara paused at the door and looked back at him. Her expression softened, just slightly. "I know," she said. "That's why I picked you." She disappeared back to her desk, leaving Kael standing alone in the center of his office. He was breathing hard, his heart still hammering in his chest. She had picked him. She had looked at a room full of candidates, a room full of terrified, incompetent men, and she had picked him. He walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. Sterling City glittered below him, a million points of light. His empire, his kingdom, and now his queen. A woman who spoke in riddles and wrapped yarn around his arms and made him feel like a man who had just been given a key to a door he hadn't even known existed. He was in so much trouble, and he had never been happier. Harrison appeared at the door, his face a mask of confusion. "Mr. Sterling, the conference call is waiting. The investors are getting restless." Kael waved him away. "Cancel it. Tell them I'm in a strategic planning session." He paused. "And Harrison? Get me everything you can find on knitting. Books. Videos. I need to learn." Harrison's jaw dropped. "Knitting, sir?" Yes, Kael said, his voice deadly serious. I need to understand the methodology, the techniques, the terminology. He turned from the window, his gaze burning with intensity. I need to speak her language. Harrison nodded slowly, his brain still struggling to catch up. Of course, sir. I'll get right on it. He backed out of the room, his head spinning. The CEO, the most ruthless businessman in Sterling City, wanted to learn how to knit. The world had officially gone mad. The elevator doors slammed open with a violent metallic shriek that echoed down the executive corridor like a gunshot. A man stormed out, his face the color of a ripe tomato, his expensive suit straining against a frame that suggested he spent more time at steakhouses than gyms. He was flanked by two terrified assistants who were practically jogging to keep up with his furious, stomping gait. I want to see Sterling now, the man bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that rattled the potted ferns. This is an outrage, a complete and utter travesty. I have never been so disrespected in my entire professional career. Harrison materialized from nowhere, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Mr. Thorne, please, if you'll just wait in the conference room, I'll let Mr. Sterling know you're... Get out of my way, you pathetic little gnome! Thorne shoved Harrison aside with a meaty palm, sending the chief of staff stumbling into a filing cabinet. The sound of metal crashing against metal filled the air. The glass doors to the executive suite burst open. Thorne stormed through, his eyes blazing with entitled fury. His assistants hovered behind him like nervous chihuahuas, clutching tablets and portfolios, and looking like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Elara looked up from her desk. She had just finished winding the forest green cashmere and was now carefully laying out a new project. A half-finished sweater in shocking, vibrant pink lay draped across her workspace. It was a masterpiece of intricate cabling, each stitch a testament to hours of painstaking work. She had been saving the pink yarn for a special occasion. It was her signature color, her armor. She frowned at the interruption. Can I help you? She asked, her tone clipped. Thorne ignored her completely. He marched past her desk and pushed open the doors to Kael's office without knocking. Sterling, you have 5 seconds to explain yourself before I pull every cent of funding from your pathetic little operation. Kael looked up from his desk. He had been reviewing the knitting books Harrison had procured, his brow furrowed in concentration. The interruption was unwelcome. He rose slowly, his full, imposing height unfolding like a predator rising from a lair. Mr. Thorne, Kael said, his voice icy. I was under the impression our meeting was scheduled for tomorrow. Tomorrow, Thorne spat. Tomorrow is too late. I just got off the phone with your competitors at Zenith. They're offering me a better deal. A much better deal. And you're sitting here, wasting my time, ignoring my calls, treating me like I'm some insignificant cog in your corporate machine. Kael's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with cold, controlled rage. I have not ignored your calls. I have been in strategic planning sessions all morning. My assistant was supposed to relay. Your assistant, Thorne barked, gesturing wildly toward Elara. That little girl out there with her toys? Is that who I'm supposed to trust with my multi-million-dollar portfolio? A woman playing with string? Elara had followed the commotion. She was now standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her pink sweater clutched protectively against her chest. Her eyes were narrow slits of barely contained fury. Mr. Thorne, Kael said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You will not speak about my staff in that tone. Oh, I'll speak however I want, Thorne roared. He was waving his arms now, a violent, gesticulating frenzy of entitlement. I built this city. I made your company what it is. Without my funding, you're nothing. Absolutely nothing. His arms swung wide, a wild, theatrical gesture of dismissal. And his elbow caught the edge of the coffee cup on Elara's desk. The cup, a ceramic monstrosity filled with scalding black liquid, tipped. It toppled with agonizing slowness, a cascade of dark, bitter coffee spilling across the polished surface. The wave of liquid surged across the desk, a brown tide of destruction. It hit the half-finished sweater. It hit the pink cashmere. Virginal pink cashmere. The yarn, the precious, expensive, limited edition yarn that Elara had scrimped and saved for months to afford, soaked up the black liquid like a sponge. The vibrant pink turned a sickly, muddy brown. The delicate fibers, hand-dyed and impossibly soft, were instantly ruined. The intricate cabling was now a stained, grotesque mess. Elara stared. She stared at the sweater, at the coffee, at the spreading stain that was destroying her art, her passion, her soul. For a moment, the world went silent. Everything faded. The shouting, the tension, the terrified assistants. There was only the sweater, the ruined sweater. Then the silence shattered. Elara's face contorted. It was a transformation so sudden, so visceral, that both Kael and Thorn took an involuntary step backward. Her beautiful features twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes, usually bright and cheerful, blazed with a fury that could melt steel. "You!" she snarled, her voice dropping to a guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere primal. "You did that!" Thorn blinked, his bluster momentarily faltering. What are you talking about? It's just a bit of coffee. It'll wash out." "Wash out?" Elara's voice cracked like a whip. "Wash out? This is virgin pink cashmere. It's $40 an ounce. $40 an ounce! Do you have any idea how many hours I spent on this? Do you have any idea how many days I spent waiting for this yarn to arrive? It's discontinued. You can't even buy it anymore. It's gone. You ruined it." She grabbed the ruined sweater, the sodden, coffee-stained mass of pink and brown, and balled it up in her fists. Her knuckles were white. Her entire body was trembling with a rage that was almost seismic. And then she threw it. The sweater flew through the air like a cannonball. It hit Thorn square in the face with a wet, sodden smack. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his hands flying up to claw at the soggy, stained fabric that was now plastered against his features. Elara was on him before he could recover. She moved with the speed of a striking cobra, grabbing him by the lapels of his expensive jacket and shoving him backward into the nearest chair. His legs buckled, and he collapsed into the seat, his mouth open, his eyes wide with shock. She pulled out her longest, sharpest titanium needle. The 12-inch spike gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She brought it down, the point hovering a mere millimeter from the space between Thorn's terrified, bloodshot eyes. "Listen to me," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. "You are going to take out your checkbook. You are going to write me a check for $15,000 to cover the cost of the ruined yarn and the hours I spent on this project. You are then going to sign the contract with Mr. Sterling." She pressed the needle closer. Thorn whimpered. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Or," Elara continued, her voice dropping to a lethal purr, "I will stitch you to this chair. I will use the same technique I used on the man who tried to steal from this company. I will make it so permanent that they'll have to cut you out of the chair piece by piece. Do you understand me?" Thorn nodded frantically. His eyes were locked on the needle, his pupils dilated with primal fear. Yes, I understand. I'll write the check. I'll sign anything. Just get that thing away from me." Kael stood frozen by his desk. His heart was pounding. His palms were sweating. He had seen a lot of things in his corporate career. He had seen hostile takeovers. He had seen boardroom betrayals. He had seen men break down under pressure. He had never seen anything like this. This woman, his knitting-obsessed, yarn-winding goddess, had just taken a toxic, belligerent client and reduced him to a quivering puddle of terror. She had used a sweater as a weapon. She had threatened him with permanent needle-based immobilization. She had demanded financial restitution like a mafia don collecting tribute. She was magnificent. She was terrifying. She was his. "Harrison!" Kael barked. "Get a contract. The full one. No revisions. Mr. Thorne is going to sign it right now." Harrison scrambled forward, shoving a sheaf of papers into Thorne's trembling hands. Thorne fumbled for a pen, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He signed with a jagged, spidery scrawl that was barely legible. Elara snatched the check from his hand. She examined it, her brow furrowed. "This says 10,000, she said, her voice flat. "I said 15. Thorne let out a strangled sob. I don't have the rest in that account. I'll have to transfer it. I promise. I'll transfer it now," Elara said, her voice brooking no argument. "Right now. In front of me. I'll wait." Thorne fumbled for his phone, his thick fingers clumsy against the screen. He opened his banking app and, under the watchful gaze of the titanium needle, transferred the remaining $5,000 to an account Elara dictated to him. "There," he whimpered. "It's done. Can I go now?" Elara stepped back. She lowered the needle, but her eyes never left his face. "Get out of my sight, and if I ever see you near this office again, I will not be so merciful." Thorne scrambled to his feet and fled. His assistants scrambled after him, their faces pale, their hands shaking. The elevator doors opened, swallowed them, and closed with a soft, final ding. The executive floor was silent. Elara stood in the middle of the space, the check clutched in one hand, the titanium needle still in the other. Her chest was heaving. Her hair had come loose from its bun, falling in wild tangles around her flushed face. She looked at Kael. He was still frozen by his desk, staring at her with an expression that was part awe, part reverence, part something else entirely. Something deeper. Something rawer. 15,000, Elara said, her voice slightly shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. "Do you think that's enough?" "The yarn was discontinued. I'll never find that exact color again." Kael walked toward her. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. He stopped in front of her, close enough to see the faint tremor in her hands, the rapid rise and fall of her chest. "It's enough," he said softly. "It's more than enough. You were brilliant. You were magnificent." Elara looked up at him, her green eyes still wild with residual fury. "He ruined my sweater." Kael reached out and gently took the titanium needle from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting, electric contact. "I'll buy you 100 sweaters," he murmured. "I'll buy you the entire cashmere supply chain. Whatever you want. It's yours." Elara blinked. The rage in her eyes slowly faded, replaced by something else. Confusion. Maybe gratitude. Maybe something more. "You're strange," she said softly. "But I think I like you." Kael smiled. It was a small, genuine smile, utterly unlike the predatory smirk he usually wore. "I think I like you too." The frantic scribbling of Thorne's signature on the contract was a desperate, jagged sound, like a mouse clawing at a wall. He threw the pen across the desk, grabbed his checkbook, and sprinted for the elevator with all the dignity of a man fleeing a burning building. His assistants, still pale and shaking, scrambled after him like ducklings in a hurricane. The elevator doors closed with a soft, final chime. And then, silence. Kael stepped out of his office. He had been watching from the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression a carefully maintained mask of corporate composure. But the moment he crossed the threshold, the mask slipped. He was a man utterly, completely, hopelessly obsessed. Elara was hunched over her desk, a desperate, frantic energy radiating from her slender frame. She was dabbing at the coffee-stained yarn with a damp paper towel, her movements almost frantic. The pink cashmere was still wet, still ruined, the vibrant color now a sad, muddy brown that made her heart ache with every passing second. "Oh, no, no, no," she muttered, her voice a low, mournful chant. "This is never coming out. This is a disaster. I can't believe this. I was on the 4th repeat." The 4th repeat. Kael walked toward her. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one a calculated advance. He stopped directly behind her, close enough to see the way her shoulders trembled, the way her fingers shook as she tried to salvage the impossible. "Elara," he said softly. She didn't look up. "I'm busy. I have a crisis to manage." Kael smiled. Her crisis was a ruined sweater. Her crisis was a coffee stain. And she had just handled a multi-million-dollar business confrontation with the ferocity of a battlefield general. The dissonance was staggering. It was enchanting. He stepped closer, his chest now nearly brushing against her back. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the faint, familiar scent of lavender and wool that had haunted his dreams for the past 3 days. "Stop," he murmured. "Stop dabbing at it. It's gone. You can't fix it." Elara whirled on him, her green eyes blazing with hurt and indignation. "Don't tell me I can't fix it! I can fix anything. I can fix a drop stitch. I can fix a split ply. I can fix a snag. I can—" "You can't fix coffee, Elara," Kael said gently. He reached out and took the ruined yarn from her hands, setting it aside on the desk. His fingers brushed against hers. "But you can start over, and I'll help you." Elara stared at him. Her anger flickered, dimmed, and then faded into something softer, something more vulnerable. She looked at his face, at the intense blue of his eyes, at the way his jaw was set with quiet determination. "You don't know anything about knitting," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know enough," he said. "I've been reading. I've been studying. I'm learning your language." Elara blinked. "My language?" Kael stepped even closer. He was now inches from her, his towering frame blocking out the harsh light from the overhead fixtures. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so intimate, so possessive, that Elara's breath caught in her throat. "I want to be your partner," he said, his voice dropping to a low, husky murmur. "In every sense of the word. In business. In everything." Elara's brain short-circuited. She stared at him, utterly stunned. Partners. He wanted to be partners. He wanted to collaborate on projects, share resources, joint ventures in fiber arts. "Oh," she said, her voice faint. "Okay. That's very generous of you." Kael smiled. It was a slow, predatory smile, but there was a warmth beneath it. A genuine vulnerability. "I'm glad you agree." Elara blinked rapidly, trying to process the situation. She looked at the ruined yarn. She looked at his face. And then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she reached into her giant canvas bag and pulled out a flexible measuring tape. "Fine," she said, her voice brisk and businesslike. "If we're going to be partners, I need accurate measurements. You're going to stand still and let me do my job." Kael's eyes widened. She was taking charge. She was asserting her dominance. She was establishing the parameters of their partnership. He had never been more aroused in his entire life. "Of course," he said, his voice a low growl. "What do you need?" Elara sighed. The sound of a woman who had been forced to deal with incompetent assistants far too often. "Just stand there. Don't move. And for the love of all that is holy, don't fidget." She stepped forward, the tape measure draped over her shoulders like a scarf. She reached up and placed the metal end against the center of his chest, right over his sternum. Her fingers pressed against the fine wool of his suit, the warmth of his body bleeding through the fabric. "Arms out," she commanded. Kael obeyed. He spread his arms wide, his biceps straining against the constraints of his jacket. Elara looped the tape measure around his chest, pulling it snug against his ribs. Her hands worked quickly, efficiently, her fingers brushing against his sides as she adjusted the tape. Click. She noted the number. 48 inches, she murmured, writing it down on a scrap of paper. Impressive. Kael's heart hammered. 48 inches. She was measuring his chest. She was cataloging his physical dimensions. For what purpose? A tactical bulletproof vest? A custom-designed exosuit for executive protection? His mind raced with possibilities. She moved to his shoulders, the tape measure sliding across his collarbone. Her face was close to his now, close enough that he could see the faint, almost invisible freckles dusted across her nose. Her breath ghosted across his jaw, warm and soft. "Tilt your head," she ordered. He tilted. She looped the tape around his neck, her fingers lingering against the sensitive skin just above his collar. He felt a shiver run down his spine. He felt his pulse quicken, his blood rush to his face. 18 inches, she murmured. Solid. She stepped behind him. The tape measure slid across his shoulders, spanning the broad expanse of his back. Her hands were firm, commanding, tracing the contours of his muscles with an almost clinical detachment. 24 inches across, she said, writing it down. You have excellent shoulder structure. Kael swallowed hard. Excellent shoulder structure. She was complimenting his physique. She was assessing his physical capabilities. For a tactical suit. For a custom-fit armor system. For what? She stepped back in front of him and reached for his arm. She took his wrist in one hand, her fingers cool and soft against his skin, and began to measure the length from his shoulder to his elbow. Relax, she said, tapping his arm. You're all tense. I can't get an accurate reading if you're flexing. Kael forced himself to relax. He forced his muscles to unclench, his shoulders to drop. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Her touch was electric. Her presence was overwhelming. She was studying him. She was cataloging him. She was making him hers. What is this for? He asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. A tactical suit? Custom body armor? Elara looked up from her notepad, her brow furrowed in confusion. What? No, it's for your sweater. Kael blinked. My sweater? Yes, your sweater. She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The pink one. The jacquard. I'm going to make you a custom pink jacquard sweater. But you're too broad. I'm going to need a lot more yarn. Like, a lot more yarn. Kael's brain, the brilliant corporate engine that had outmaneuvered entire industries, ground to a halt. A sweater. She was measuring him for a sweater. A pink sweater. A jacquard sweater. Not a tactical suit. Not a bulletproof vest. A sweater. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. You're making me a sweater? He finally managed. Elara nodded, still writing on her notepad. Yes, obviously. I can't just let you walk around in those boring gray suits forever. You need color. You need personality. You need a pink jacquard sweater with a complex cable pattern that I have not yet designed, but will absolutely design by the end of the week. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. It's going to be magnificent. I'm going to use the same technique I was going to use on my sweater. The one that was ruined. The one that Thorn destroyed. Her expression darkened for a moment, then brightened again. But your sweater is going to be even better. Because you're taller. And broader. And you have nice shoulders. Kael's brain was still short-circuiting. You think I have nice shoulders? Elara shrugged. They're functional. They're good for holding up a sweater. Now, hold still. I need to measure your arms. And I need to know if you're allergic to wool. Kael stared at her. She was asking if he was allergic to wool. She was measuring him for a hand-knitted sweater. A pink hand-knitted sweater. His entire world, his carefully constructed corporate identity, his image as a ruthless, cold-blooded CEO, was being dismantled by a woman with a tape measure and a yarn obsession. No, he said, his voice faint. I'm not allergic to wool. Good. She looped the tape around his bicep, her fingers pressing against the hard muscle beneath his sleeve. 15 inches. Very nice. You're going to need a lot of yarn. A lot of pink yarn. I hope you're ready for that. I'm ready for anything, Kael said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Anything you want. Elara looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his intense blue gaze. For a moment, the mask slipped. For a moment, she saw something in his expression. Something raw. Something vulnerable. Something that made her stomach flutter. Okay, she said, her voice softer now. Good, because this is going to be a big project. You might have to stand still for me a lot. And you might have to hold yarn for me. And you might have to let me boss you around. Kael smiled. It was a genuine smile. A smile that transformed his harsh, angular features into something almost boyish. I'm looking forward to it. Elara felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She looked away, her fingers tightening on the tape measure. Good, she said again, her voice slightly strained. Now go back to your office. I have to order more yarn. This is going to bankrupt you. I hope you're prepared. Kael didn't move. He just stood there, looking at her with an expression of absolute adoration. I'm prepared, he said softly. I'm prepared for anything, as long as you're with me. Alara's blush deepened. She shoved the tape measure back into her bag and turned away, her hands suddenly clumsy. Stop being weird, she muttered. Just go. I have work to do. Kael laughed. It was a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to vibrate through the entire executive floor. He turned and walked back toward his office, his footsteps light, his heart lighter. He had been measured. He had been cataloged. He was getting a pink sweater. He had never been happier in his entire life. The heavy, echoing footsteps of Kael marching down the marble hallway 1 week later sent a tremor of primal fear through the executive floor. Each footfall was a measured, deliberate strike, a drumbeat of impending doom that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of Apex Vanguard's headquarters. The boardroom was packed. 12 of the most powerful executives in Sterling City sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces pale, their postures rigid. They had been summoned for the most critical executive board meeting of the decade. The quarterly projections were in flux. The zenith threat was still looming. And Kael Sterling, their cold, ruthless, utterly terrifying CEO, was about to walk through those doors. Harrison stood by the window, his handkerchief already damp with nervous sweat. He had been the one to deliver the news. The CEO was coming. He was coming now. Everyone stay calm, Harrison whispered, his voice trembling. Remember your breathing exercises. Remember the training. Whatever happens, do not make eye contact unless absolutely necessary. The board members nodded frantically. Some of them were visibly shaking. One of them, a portly man named Gerald, had already developed a nervous twitch in his left eye. The glass doors at the far end of the boardroom shuddered. And then they exploded open. Kael Sterling kicked them with the force of a battering ram. The doors flew wide, slamming against the walls with a deafening crack that sent several board members leaping out of their chairs. And then they saw him. The cold, ruthless billionaire. The man who had single-handedly dismantled 3 hostile takeovers and reduced a dozen competitors to bankruptcy was wearing a sweater. A pink sweater. A thick, chunky, aggressively bright pink knit sweater that looked like it had been crocheted by a hyperactive unicorn on a sugar high. It was wool. It was chunky. It was aggressively, unapologetically pink. And emblazoned across the chest, in a slightly darker shade of pink, was a massive, unmistakable heart. A heart. A giant, chunky, knit-in design heart that practically pulsed with cheerful, unironic warmth. Kael stood in the doorway, his towering frame silhouetted against the harsh light of the hallway. His shoulders were impossibly broad, the chunky pink wool stretching across his biceps like a second skin. His jaw was set. His eyes were blazing with cold, corporate fury. He wore the sweater with the terrifying pride of a king wearing battle armor into a war. The boardroom went absolutely silent. Gerald's nervous twitch became a full-blown facial spasm. A woman named Patricia dropped her tablet, the device clattering against the table with a sharp thwack. Harrison's handkerchief fell from his nerveless fingers, floating to the ground like a white flag of surrender. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Nobody dared. Kael strode into the room, his footsteps echoing with the same lethal precision as before. The sweater swished around his torso with each movement, the chunky knit catching the light in a way that somehow made him look even more intimidating. The contrast was staggering. He was a predator wrapped in a hug. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. He stopped at the head of the table and slammed his palms down on the polished surface. The sound was a gunshot in the oppressive silence. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "Ladies, we have a crisis. Zenith is circling. Our quarterly projections are a disaster, and I have just spent the last week being measured for this garment." He gestured at the sweater with a dismissive flick of his wrist, as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than a neon pink sartorial catastrophe. "So here's what's going to happen," Kael continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "We are going to push through the Sterling Textile merger. We are going to crush Zenith into dust. And we are going to do it efficiently. Does anyone have any objections?" The board members shook their heads frantically. They would have agreed to anything at that moment. They would have agreed to invade a small country if he had asked. The combination of the pink sweater and the ruthless corporate glare was too much for their fragile psyches to handle. Elara sat in the corner of the room, her legs crossed, her titanium needles clicking softly in the silence. She was wearing a matching scarf, a brilliant pink creation that perfectly complemented the monstrosity on Kael's chest. She had finished it the night before, unable to resist the symmetry of the ensemble. She watched the board members squirm with undisguised amusement. They were terrified. They were utterly, completely terrified. And why? Because a man was wearing a sweater. Ridiculous. "Good," Kael said, straightening up. "Now, let's talk strategy. Harrison, the acquisition numbers. Gerald, the logistics. I want a full breakdown of the timeline." The meeting proceeded in a blur of terrified compliance. Kael dominated the room with the same ferocity he always did. But now there was a new element. A bizarre, surreal element that left everyone off balance. Every time he gestured, the pink sweater shifted. Every time he leaned forward, the giant heart on his chest seemed to pulse with malevolent cheerfulness. Nobody dared mention it. Nobody dared laugh. Nobody dared even smile. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Their brains simply could not reconcile the image of their ruthless CEO in a pink sweater with the reality of his terrifying corporate dominance. Elara continued to knit. She was working on a new project now, a matching pair of gloves. Her needles clicked with a soothing, rhythmic cadence that seemed to mock the tension in the room. The meeting dragged on for 2 hours. 2 hours of intense, high-stakes corporate strategy. 2 hours of Kael barking orders and the board members scrambling to comply. 2 hours of the pink sweater looming over them like a psychedelic nightmare. Finally, mercifully, it ended. "Dismissed," Kael said, his voice flat. The board members practically fled. They scrambled out of their chairs, grabbed their portfolios, and stampeted toward the doors. Harrison was the last to leave, his face still pale, his eyes still wide. He gave Elara a look of pure, unadulterated bewilderment before disappearing into the hallway. The doors closed behind him. The boardroom was silent. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic click, click, click of Elara's knitting needles. Kael turned from the table. He walked toward her, his footsteps slow, deliberate. The pink sweater swished with every movement. The giant heart on his chest seemed to beat in time with his pulse. He stopped in front of her. He looked down at her, his expression a complex mixture of adoration, exasperation, and something far deeper, something that made Elara's stomach flutter, despite herself. "You made me look like a walking Valentine," he said, his voice low. Elara looked up at him, her green eyes gleaming with mischief. "You look magnificent. I told you. Pink is your color. It brings out your eyes." Kael's lips twitched. He was trying to maintain his stern facade, but it was crumbling. It was crumbling fast. The board members were terrified, he said. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't process it. "That was the point," Elara said, returning her attention to her knitting. "They're off balance. They're confused. They're scared. It's a psychological tactic. You should thank me." Kael laughed. It was a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to shake the very foundations of the boardroom. "You are the most terrifying person I have ever met." "I know," Elara said, not looking up. "Now come here. I need to check your gauge." She reached out and grabbed the hem of the sweater, tugging him closer. Kael stumbled forward, caught off guard by her sudden, aggressive pull. He landed directly in front of her, his knees bumping against her chair, his towering frame looming over her. Elara's hands were on his chest. Her fingers traced the line of the heart, pressing against the chunky knit, feeling the warmth of his body beneath the wool. Her expression was focused, clinical, utterly professional. "The gauge looks good," she murmured. "The tension is consistent. The decreases are clean. I'm impressed." Kael's breath caught in his throat. She was touching him. She was touching his chest. She was tracing the contours of his body through the sweater she had made for him. Her fingers were so close to his heart, so dangerously close. "Elara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. She looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his intense blue gaze. For a moment, the mask slipped. For a moment, she saw the vulnerability beneath the corporate armor, the raw, unguarded need. "Yes," she said, her voice softer now. "I want matching gloves," he said, his voice low and husky. "I want you to knit me matching gloves to go with this masterpiece." Elara blinked. "Gloves? That's what you want to say right now? Gloves?" Kael nodded slowly. His eyes never left hers. "Gloves. And then, after you finish the gloves, I want you to knit me a hat, and a scarf, and maybe another sweater. A blue one this time, or green, whatever you think is best." Elara's lips curved into a slow, genuine smile. "You're going to bankrupt me, you know. I have expensive taste in yarn." Kael smiled back. It was a soft, almost boyish smile that transformed his harsh features into something warm, something tender. "I don't care about the money," he said. I just want you." And then, without warning, he leaned down. His hand shot out, sweeping her yarn bag off the table and onto the floor. The needles clattered against the marble. The yarn rolled away, a cascade of pink and blue and green. The bag hit the ground with a soft thump. And then his hands were cupping her face. And then his lips were on hers. The kiss was breathtaking. It was dominant. It was possessive. It was everything Kael had been holding back for the past week. Everything he had been suppressing. Everything he had been longing for. His mouth moved against hers with a fierce, demanding intensity that left Elara gasping. She responded instinctively. Her hands came up to grip his shoulders, her fingers digging into the chunky pink wool. She pulled him closer, her body arching against his. The kiss deepened. The world faded. There was nothing but the warmth of his lips, the strength of his embrace, the overwhelming, intoxicating presence of him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Elara's cheeks were flushed. Her hair had come loose from its messy bun. Her eyes were wide, dazed, utterly stunned. "Wow," she said, her voice faint. That was unexpected." Kael smiled. It was a predatory smile, but there was warmth beneath it, a genuine, unguarded tenderness. "That was a long time coming," he said softly. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment you pinned that spy to the table." Elara blinked. "You're insane," she said. "You're completely, utterly insane." "Yes," Kael agreed. "I am. But I'm your insane. And you're mine." He pulled her into another kiss, this one softer, gentler, but no less passionate. Elara melted against him, her hands still gripping the pink sweater, her heart racing in her chest. The yarn bag lay on the floor, its contents scattered across the marble. The titanium needles gleamed under the harsh light. The balls of yarn rolled lazily, as if they were applauding. Elara broke the kiss, breathless, her green eyes sparkling with something that might have been love, might have been madness, might have been both. "Okay," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "But I still need to measure your hands. The gloves aren't going to knit themselves." Kael laughed. It was a full, open, joyous laugh that echoed through the empty boardroom. He pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her, the pink sweater pressing against her chest. "Measure away," he said, his voice a low, rumbling murmur. "I'm all yours," Elara smiled. She reached down and picked up the measuring tape that had fallen from her bag, her fingers brushing against his as she straightened up. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I picked you." The boardroom was silent. The boardroom was empty. The boardroom was theirs. Sometimes, the most ruthless corporate strategy is just knowing how to properly bind off a dropped stitch. If you loved watching this knitting-obsessed heroine accidentally conquer a billionaire CEO, make sure to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments. What would you do if you accidentally wore a pink heart sweater to a corporate board meeting?